I thought he'd come back. He never looked back. That's what the thought kept repeating itself in my head, even though I wasn't thinking about anyone else. Not really. I was thinking about her. It was a Tuesday, and the air in the bookstore felt too warm, the smell of old pages mixed with the faint tang of coffee from the cafe corner. I had stopped coming here often, not that I'd admitted it to anyone. But she was behind the counter that day, scanning books with that calm precision that made it look effortless. Mid-40s, hair caught in a loose bun, glasses sliding down her nose, sleeves rolled up just so. I couldn't stop noticing the little things. The way her ring caught the light, the soft tap of her pen on the ledger, the pause before she answered a customer's question like she was considering every word before it left her mouth. I walked in pretending to browse, fingers grazing the spines as if that could somehow mask why I was really there. She glanced up once, and it was like the world tilted. A fraction of a second, but it landed somewhere in my chest. I caught her looking, but she didn't linger. She tucked her hair behind her ear and smiled. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly. I swore I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know her well, really. A few encounters over weeks, maybe months, fleeting conversations about books I pretended to like, and a small joke she made once about the old typewriter display that left me laughing longer than I should have. And yet, something about her presence made me feel off balance, like I was waiting for something I didn't know how to ask for. That morning she had been unusually quiet, humming under her breath while arranging a display of new releases. I leaned against the counter. Hey, the new Murakami came in. My voice sounded stupid even to me. She looked up, brow slightly furrowed, then relaxed into that effortless composure that made her seem both distant and immediate at once. Yes, shelf B, third row from the top. Her voice had that calm steadiness, but when she spoke, I felt like she was speaking just for me, though she wasn't. Then there was that pause. Nothing dramatic. She waited while I reached for the book, fingers brushing the spine. Our hands almost touched, and I jerked back like I'd burned myself. She didn't comment, didn't laugh. Just a quiet glance, lingering maybe a second too long, before she turned back to the ledger. And I stayed frozen for longer than necessary, watching the way the sunlight slanted across her cheek, the faint crease at the corner of her eye when she smiled politely at a passing customer. There's a kind of electricity in those brief moments, the kind you can't name, can't capture, can't decide if it's dangerous or safe. I wanted to say something, anything, that would make her look at me again, but my mouth refused. Instead, I just left the book on the counter, muttered a thank you, and forced myself to leave. Outside, the sun hit my face, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was that pause, that glance, and the way the air had felt heavier for a moment, like it had been waiting for something too. I walked down the street, trying to convince myself I'd forget it, that I'd just come in for the book, but I knew I wouldn't. Not really. I thought she'd come back into my thoughts again, like she had 100 times before, but she never looked back, and I kept wondering why I even hoped she would. And yet, there it was, the tiny, unclaimed space she had left inside me, and I couldn't stop turning it over in my head. I hadn't planned to stay late that night, but there I was, helping her rearrange the storage room at the bookstore. Boxes stacked too high, shelves that needed adjusting, the smell of dust, and old paper heavy in the air. She moved with quiet efficiency, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders I hadn't noticed before. You don't have to. I started, gesturing toward the heaviest box, but she waved me off with that gentle authority she carried so naturally. Still, her lips twitched slightly, like she almost smiled, and I felt a small victory in noticing it. Her hands were steady as she lifted a box, but the skin around her knuckles was dry, the veins faintly visible under the soft light. She caught my glance and immediately straightened, masking whatever vulnerability I thought I'd glimpsed. We worked in silence for a while. She hummed under her breath occasionally, but it was quieter this time, less confident than usual. I wanted to ask if she was okay, wanted to make her laugh the way she'd made me laugh before, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I watched. The faint crease near her eye when she squinted, the way her hair fell loose despite her earlier bun, the almost imperceptible slump of her shoulders after lifting another box. "Do you want a break?" I asked finally, trying to keep my voice casual. She paused, leaning against a shelf, hands gripping the edges for balance. "I know. I'm fine," she said, and I could tell she was lying. Her voice was softer than usual, fragile almost. She ran a hand over her forehead and let out a sigh that sounded more like a confession than anything else. I didn't know if I should speak or stay quiet. The tension between us was almost tangible. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself just observing, learning her rhythms, the faint sound of her breath, the subtle shifts of weight from one foot to the other, the way her fingers brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear again and again. At one point, she looked at me, really looked, and the guarded wall fell away for just a second. Her eyes flickered, and I swear I saw something like hesitation, maybe regret, maybe a question she didn't voice. My chest tightened. I handed her another box without thinking, and our fingers brushed. She stiffened instantly, but didn't pull away. Just a moment, a simple touch, but it carried an entire conversation neither of us was ready to have. She shifted her gaze to the floor, lips pressed together, and I realized how tired she looked, more than I'd noticed before. Not just physically, but like the weight of everything she carried was finally showing, if only slightly. And then she laughed. Not the casual laugh she gave customers, but a soft, private one, almost self-conscious, almost embarrassed. I felt it in my chest, and I couldn't look away. The room was still and heavy, and yet somehow charged. She turned back to the shelves, pretending to focus, but I stayed there, noticing the small, unspoken things. The way she breathed, the way she paused mid-motion, the way, for just a heartbeat, she let the world slip and let me see the edges she usually hid. It was a quiet kind of electricity, one I couldn't name or control. I wanted to say something, anything, but instead I just stood there, watching her, and something unspoken hovered between us, delicate, fragile, and utterly impossible to ignore. The rain started slow, then faster, drumming against the bookstore windows. I was supposed to leave, but the storm made everything feel smaller, quieter, like the world had condensed around just the two of us. She was still there, stacking returned books, sleeves rolled up, hair damp from the humidity creeping through the open door. I leaned against the counter, pretending to check my phone, but I wasn't really looking at it. My eyes kept flicking to her, the way her fingers lingered on the spines of the books, the slight tremor in her hands when she reached for a box too heavy for her alone. I wanted to step forward, to steady it, to steady her, but I froze. "Do you want some help?" I asked anyway, voice too casual. She glanced up, and for the briefest instant, her guard faltered. Something soft passed through her expression, a hesitation, a question unspoken. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly. "No, I've got it." We worked side by side in silence. The storm outside made the room feel smaller, closer. Our shoulders brushed once, and I felt it, the jolt of proximity that made my stomach tighten. I wanted to say something, anything that would bridge the space between us, but the words refused me. Then her phone buzzed. She picked it up, eyes narrowing at the screen. An X, judging by the name flashing across the display. She stared at it a moment too long, fingers hovering before she swiped it away. I noticed the flicker of frustration, the faint tightening of her jaw, the way she exhaled sharply but tried to hide it. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but I stayed quiet, feeling like speaking would break something delicate that hadn't been named yet. I caught a glance of her lips pressing together as she returned to the shelves, then glanced toward me, a trace of something in her eyes, regret, longing, maybe fear. I couldn't tell. The rain outside hit harder, masking the quiet tension between us, and I realized I could lean in, just a fraction, and maybe she'd notice. Maybe something would finally slip past the careful walls she'd built. My chest tightened, a tug between restraint and desire. I kept my hands tucked close to my body, the small ache of wanting to close the space between us gnawing at me. I could feel her warmth a foot away, smell the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the paper and coffee lingering in the room. She reached for a book on the top shelf. I stepped closer to help, But before our hands could touch, the bell over the door jingled. A customer, late, drenched, needing something mundane and immediate. The moment shattered. We froze. She adjusted her hair, offered a polite, professional smile, and turned back to the ledger as if nothing had happened. My heart still raced, and I caught myself staring at her hands for a second too long, the brief warmth of almost touch lingering like a phantom. I left soon after, the storm still hammering outside, but the memory of that half-glance, that near moment, followed me out the door. I kept thinking of her, of how close we had been without ever crossing the line, and how painfully aware I was of every inch I hadn't bridged. And yet, even in that restraint, there was a spark, an unclaimed, fragile heat that refused to go away. I found her in the back corner of the bookstore, crouched behind a low shelf with the day's receipts scattered around her. The room smelled faintly of paper and damp from the rain outside. I leaned against the edge of the counter, pretending to sort some books, but I wasn't really working. I was watching her. She looked up, eyes meeting mine for a long moment. There was something raw there, something that didn't need words, and I felt the pull in my chest that had been growing for months. "Do you ever think about what this is?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, almost swallowed by the hum of the overhead lights. She froze, brow knitting slightly. A long pause, and then she let out a breath I could feel in my own lungs. I don't know," she admitted, almost a whisper. Her fingers brushed the receipts, as if avoiding eye contact could somehow erase the question. I moved closer, careful to keep a respectful distance, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off her. "It doesn't feel normal anymore," I said. "I mean us. How we whatever this is. It's not just coincidence." And I stopped. Words felt too fragile, too risky. She didn't interrupt, just tilted her head slightly, watching me, waiting, giving me that space that made me want to spill everything at once. "I think about it all the time," I continued, slower now, almost to myself. "How I notice things, stupid little things, like the way you fold your sleeves, or the way you laugh when you think no one's looking. And I can't just ignore it anymore." She didn't move. Her lips pressed together, a thin line. Her hands shook slightly, betraying a calm she didn't want me to see. I thought I could," she murmured, finally, voice unsteady. "I thought I could keep it normal. But it's not. It hasn't been normal for a long time." The air between us felt heavy, almost solid. Rain pattered against the windows, but inside, the silence stretched, pressing us closer without a single touch. My fingers itched to reach out, to offer something tangible, but I stayed still, letting the tension sit, letting her words echo. "What do we do?" I asked finally, voice barely above the sound of my own heartbeat. She swallowed, blinking rapidly, looking anywhere but at me. "I don't know," she whispered, and there was a raw honesty in that confession that cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. We stood there, two bodies close, two hearts tangled in something unnamed. The world outside continued, oblivious to the storm inside this small bookstore, and I realized we had crossed a line with words alone, a line that made pretending impossible. She looked at me one last time before turning away slightly, and I could see the weight she carried in that slight slump of her shoulders, the unspoken conflict in her gaze. "I'm scared," she said, voice almost breaking, and in that moment, I understood that neither of us could go back to pretending nothing was happening. And then she let the silence swallow the rest of it. I arrived early that morning, partly because I couldn't sleep, partly because I didn't want to face the hours without seeing her. The bookstore smelled faintly of rain and coffee, quiet except for the soft rustle of pages. She was at the counter, sorting through a stack of old letters, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. She looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something heavier there, a weight I hadn't noticed before. "I didn't think anyone came in this early," she murmured, voice low, almost fragile. "I needed a reason," I said, setting my bag down and leaning against the counter. "To come here, to see you." I immediately wished I hadn't said it. She didn't flinch, didn't answer, just kept her fingers tracing the edges of the letters. What are these? I asked, nodding toward the stack. She hesitated, then picked one up carefully, as if it might break in her hands. Old letters. From a long time ago. Someone I lost, and maybe never really got over. Her voice shook, just slightly. I didn't know what to say. There was a quiet, almost sacred tension in the room. The rain outside was steady, and the bookstore felt like a small island suspended in time. Do you want to read one? She asked finally. I nodded, moving closer but not too close, the air between us charged with something fragile and unspoken. She handed me a folded envelope, faded and creased. The handwriting was familiar in its intimacy, and as I read, I felt my stomach knot. The words were full of hope, regret, longing, the same feelings I had when I watched her from across the counter, pretending I didn't notice. I looked up at her, and she was staring down at her hands, lips pressed together. I never told anyone, she said quietly. I thought I could bury it, pretend it didn't matter. But it does. I reached out, almost impulsively, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She flinched, not away, but the tension in her body shifted subtly. I know, I said softly. I see it. All of it. You don't have to pretend with me. Her eyes flickered up, meeting mine, and for a moment, the world seemed smaller. The rain outside, the shelves of books, everything else faded. There was something raw in her gaze, a mix of vulnerability and quiet strength that made my chest ache. I thought I could forget, she admitted, voice barely audible. But every time I think I've moved on, it's like that part of me is still standing there, waiting. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was stand there, feeling the weight of her words, the tremor in her hands, the faint catch in her breath. I wanted to tell her she wasn't alone, that she never would be. But the words felt too small for what I was feeling. She looked at me then, and I felt it, a seismic shift in something unspoken, a quiet, undeniable pull. Her gaze lingered, searching, questioning, and I realized that the line between what was past and what could be was thinner than I had ever imagined. And then she let the letters fall onto the counter, her fingers brushing mine as they did, and the touch was electric, tender, and terrifying all at once. The store was nearly empty that evening, the rain having finally slowed to a drizzle. I was stacking books, pretending I was busy, but really I was watching her as she sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a pile of returns. There was something in the way she moved, deliberate but gentle, that made my chest tighten. She glanced up at me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. No words, no jokes, no pretense. Just the quiet understanding that had been growing between us, patient and stubborn, for weeks. You don't have to do all of that, I said softly, nodding toward the stack she was sorting. She shook her head, lips pressed together, eyes focused but not unkind. I like having order, she murmured, even if it's just in the books. I moved closer and crouched beside her, careful not to crowd her. The silence stretched comfortably, almost like a conversation in itself. I could feel her breath shift, notice the slight tremor in her hands, and I wanted to reach out, but I let it linger, savoring the tension that had been building for so long. You know, I said finally, almost to myself, I think we've been pretending this isn't happening. Her eyes flicked up, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she exhaled, a quiet, shaky sound. Yes, I know. Her voice was low, careful, but it carried weight. I reached out slowly, resting my hand on the edge of hers as it lay on the stack of books. She didn't pull away. She didn't push me closer. She just let me be there, and that was enough, more than enough. We stayed like that for a long minute, hands nearly touching, the small space between us humming with everything we hadn't said. I didn't want to break it with words. We didn't need them. The silence said more than any confession ever could. I don't want to rush anything, she whispered, voice barely audible, but it was enough. Enough to know she felt the same unspoken pull, enough to know she understood that the boundaries we'd both carefully respected were dissolving gently, inevitably. I shifted slightly, letting my fingers brush hers, a deliberate but tentative contact. She turned her hand, letting our palms rest together. The warmth, the simple weight of connection, anchored something deep inside me that had been unraveling for weeks. We didn't lean in, didn't kiss, didn't name it. We didn't have to. Being here, in this small corner of the bookstore, sharing the quiet understanding, was the acknowledgement itself. The storm outside had stopped completely, leaving only the soft patter of residual rain on the windows. I looked down at her, at the faint crease near her eyes when she smiled just slightly, and I felt the culmination of everything. The tension, the uncertainty, the near misses, the words unspoken. Finally, she leaned back slightly, a slow exhale, resting her forehead lightly against the edge of the counter. I stayed there, fingers still brushing hers, breathing in the quiet aftermath of all the small, fragile steps we had taken to reach this point. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive, but it was ours, fragile and earned and real. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself believe that maybe this, whatever it was enough. I still remember that evening in the bookstore, the quiet after the storm, like it had paused the world just for us. Sometimes I think about how small the space felt then, just the two of us and the soft hum of lights, the faint scent of old paper and coffee, and how much had shifted in that silence. I've realized since then that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it's measured in the smallest gestures, a shared glance, the brush of fingers, the patience to wait without asking for more. She taught me that. She taught me that connection isn't always about saying the words. It's about being present, noticing the quiet tremors in each other's lives, and choosing to stay. She changed too, though I'm sure she wouldn't admit it outright. I saw it in the way she now lets herself laugh without reservation, in the softness she carries in moments when she doesn't have to be guarded. The wall she built around her past heartbreak hasn't disappeared, but it has shifted. She leans into the present now, letting someone, me, imperfect as I am, see the edges she once hid. I think about how much we've both learned about restraint, patience, and understanding. I learned that my impulse to rush toward desire could be tempered by empathy and observation. I learned that noticing the small, almost invisible details about someone can matter more than any grand gesture. There were moments when it felt like the world was too loud, when every instinct screamed to act, to confess, to cross lines too soon. And yet, the slow-burning pace, the careful attention to each small step, brought us here, to a place that feels fragile but solid, quiet but undeniable. We still meet in that same corner of the bookstore sometimes, and it's not dramatic. There's no fanfare, no lightning strike of romance. Just the subtle warmth of understanding, the way hands find each other naturally, the way a shared silence can be louder than any conversation. It's a love that has patience, a love that is earned in the smallest increments. I think that's what stays with me. The afterglow of learning that love doesn't have to scream to be real. That sometimes the most profound connections are the ones that linger quietly, that grow in the spaces between words, in the hesitation before a touch, in the careful choice to notice and stay. And in that lingering quiet, I know that whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Not because we're fearless, but because we've learned how to be human with each other, fully and without pretense. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?